Hello and a very good day. Thank you so much for joining in on today's webinar. My name is Abhilash, and I am from the AD Solutions team here at Manage Engine, and I will be your presenter for today. Now, before we go ahead and jump in, I would like to thank all of you for taking out the time amidst your busy schedule. I understand that this is just the starting of the week, and most of us are working from home or from the office. And I would like to thank each and every one of you for making out the time. Now, before we go ahead and jump in and take a look at today's agenda and what we have in store for us today, I would like to run a quick audio and a video check because I want to make sure that all of you all present out here today are able to hear me well and are able to see the screen well. So if my voice is well and audible without any distortion or without any breakage in the audio, can you give me a confirmation using the chat window or the Q&A tab, please? Just say yes, just say okay, just say great, so I can confirm that my voice is reaching to you well and clear. Awesome. Looks like everything is okay. I hope you guys can see the video as well. At any point in time, if you're facing any difficulties with the audio or video, or if you feel there is a lag between the audio or video, just let me know using the chat window and I'll do my best to get that fixed on my end. With that said, just another update that this recording that's happening right now is going to be recorded. And the YouTube link to this particular webinar session will be shared with you on your respective email addresses very soon. So if you've got any questions during the course of the webinar, feel free to use the Q&A tab. Keep your questions coming. I'll do my best to answer your questions during the course of the webinar. And even if I miss answering your questions, please do not worry. The last 10 to 15 minutes will be a dedicated Q&A session. So I will be answering your questions then as well. And of course, if you have anything on your mind or anything regarding today's webinar or the solution shown today, if you have anything that you'd like to ask me later in the day post today's webinar, just shoot me an email at abi@manageengine.com. That's abi@manageengine.com. And I'd be more than happy to help you out. Right? So yes, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump in and let's see what we have in store for us today. The topic or the agenda for today's webinar is everything you need to know to secure your Azure infrastructure, right? So why Azure? Why are we looking into Azure in specific, right? Because most organizations are still using Active Directory. Some of you all may even use other cloud services like AWS or Google Public Cloud. So why the special focus towards this public cloud service, namely Azure Active Directory? Right. So this is the condition after the pandemic has hit us. Right. So if you take a look at the graph right here, you will notice that enterprises, small, medium businesses, and your large size businesses in general are all adopting cloud more heavily after the pandemic hit them. Right. So there is an increase in cloud usage from what it was back in 2019 and now in 2020 and in 2021. Right. If you take a look at this graph right here, you will notice that many cloud services are being adopted by organizations. And yes, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud are the pioneers or are the leaders in public cloud adoption. Right. So I do not wish to complicate this further. We all know that pandemic has forced us into a remote work lifestyle. So the three important things that organizations need to think about right now is to preserve cash and optimize IT costs. Second is to secure a remote workforce. This is the most important because since our users are all remote now, they will be accessing data remotely from their workstations and probably even from their home PCs. So securing a remote workforce takes priority, and also to ensure scalability. Right? Storage may go up, storage may go down. There may be a sudden influx of licenses. Your users may need more licenses, they may need lesser licenses, they may need more rights, more permissions, and a cloud service must be able to ensure all of this. Right? So in order to preserve cash, in order to secure a remote workforce, and in order to address the growing needs of users with respect to scalability or with respect to the resources they need to do their job efficiently whilst they're working from home, investing in a cloud became a convenient option to address all of these needs, right? So with a proper public cloud infrastructure implemented alongside your on-premise infrastructure or just the cloud infrastructure alone, an IT company can preserve cash because they need not invest in in-house equipment or in-house hardware or infrastructure anymore. They can secure and support a remote workforce because with the cloud infrastructure, you can better handle security for your remote servers or your remote users. And also you can ensure that all the resources in your organization are accessed in a secure manner. And number three, whenever users need access to more applications, to more services so they can do their job more efficiently, a cloud service can help you easily deploy these applications or services, right? So in short, the COVID-19 pandemic has validated the cloud's value. It has proved to us once again that cloud infrastructures are important and they are the future of IT environments and organizations, right? Now, I'm not saying that you've already adopted cloud infrastructures, but you are at least thinking about adopting a cloud infrastructure, right? So what are the trends that drive cloud adoption in 2021? Number one, like I said, it must be easy on the pocket, right? That this is the first most important thing. Whenever your users need to access more applications and services, there should not be an extra charge or a hidden cost that administrators of an organization don't know about, right? Whenever your organization needs to increase its storage space or reduce its storage space, there should not be an influx of costs. So your organizations basically need to increase and decrease the amount of the usage in the cloud without breaking their wallet or without burning a hole in their pocket, right? That's the first thing. A cloud service must produce easy scalability, must be scalable without extra expenditure or without shedding out extra money, right? And most cloud services, most organizations, they look for cloud services that support other cloud services in general, right? So this is also called multi-cloud. So for example, let's say you like a feature in Azure Active Directory. And let's say you like to store your data in AWS in the S3 buckets, right? Let's say you like how identity and access management happens in Google Cloud or GCP. So a multi-cloud service essentially allows your administrators or your organization to adopt the best features of various public cloud services like AWS, like Google Cloud, or like even Azure Active Directory, right? The most and the biggest thing when it comes to adopting a cloud infrastructure is that they must be able to support your traditional on-premises infrastructures, for example, Active Directory, right? So this is how most organizations are built. This is how the IT infrastructure of most companies around the world is built. It is built on your on-premises infrastructures, namely your infrastructures like Active Directory. So your users are on-premise, your servers are on-premise, your file servers are on-premise, your data is on-premise. And when you adopt a cloud service, these particular on-premise resources or users or servers must be easily synced to the cloud, right? So it should not be just lift your things from on-premises and put them in the cloud. There should be a sync. There should be a connection between on-premises infrastructures and the cloud, right? And last but not the least, whenever it comes to administering or managing a cloud infrastructures, an IT admin or a help desk technician or an admin in an organization must be able to learn this, understand the UI, understand the interface, understand the cloud service quickly and secure it quickly, right? There should not be a steep learning curve when it comes to using or administering a cloud service. So yes, cloud services must be easy on the pocket. There should not be more expenditure for licenses or for expanding storage. Number two, cloud services must support other clouds so organizations can leverage the best of all cloud services. Number three, cloud service must support traditional on-premises infrastructures. Number four, cloud services must be easy to administer or manage. There should not be complexities. There should not be a steep learning curve, right? So Azure AD is a go-to choice for most cloud services. Right? If you take a look at the graph that I just showed you, you will notice that AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud are the three most adopted cloud services when compared to 2021 and 2020. But Azure is quickly catching up with AWS to become the most adopted cloud service, to become a top choice for public cloud service adoption in 2021, right? So why is that? Why is Azure adopted by organizations? The answer to that is pretty simple, right? Most organizations already run on Windows infrastructures. They use infrastructures like Active Directory. They use Windows systems in their organization, and naturally adopting a cloud service that is also supported by Microsoft, that uses tools that are similar to Microsoft or Windows platforms. Azure becomes a go-to choice in most organizations, right? So looking at the graph, this is the status of public cloud adoption in enterprises, in small, medium businesses, in larger businesses in 2021 and in 2020. It is pretty clear that Azure will be the most adopted cloud service, if not now, at least in the future, right? So Azure does have its own features. For example, Azure is updated now. Azure is better from your traditional on-premises Active Directory, right? So Azure Active Directory is a directory service in the cloud. So more accessibility for your users, and Azure also offers better security controls when compared to your on-premises Active Directory, right? Azure supports multiple services and platforms. For example, Azure easily integrates with your traditional on-premises AD infrastructure. Azure supports Office 3 applications like Office 365, Microsoft Teams, Business for Skype, etc. Because Azure is by Microsoft, all of these services are by Microsoft, and both of them sync well, integrate well together. And Azure also supports many cloud applications like Salesforce, Zendesk, Dropbox, etc. Right? There are many options in Azure AD using which you can administer its infrastructure or manage its infrastructure. So if I minimize my screen, head on to my browser, you will notice my Azure console right here. And you can see that this is much better and much improved when compared to your traditional infrastructures like your on-premises Active Directory, right? All the drawbacks of Active Directory, at least most of them, have been covered in Azure Active Directory. So Azure gives you the control you never had in Active Directory with the benefits of the cloud, right? Azure also offers enhanced options for better control, right? So a major problem when it came to Active Directory infrastructures was the lack of enhanced options to better administer Active Directory, better manage Active Directory, or even to enforce security. So Azure breaks that gap by offering the enhanced features and enhanced control that you need, right? So in a nutshell, Azure will be the most adopted cloud service in the future. Azure has a lot of advantages when compared to other cloud services or your traditional on-premises Active Directory infrastructure. Everything is well and good, right? But cloud still has its own problems. If you take a look at the stats right in front of me, these are stats collected from organizations around the world, right? Small, medium businesses, larger businesses, medium businesses. And all of these organizations have adopted cloud services or are thinking about adopting cloud services. And most of them said that security, managing expenditure in the cloud, and lack of resources or expertise to administer or manage the cloud infrastructure are the three biggest challenges when it comes to adopting a cloud service. Companies are worried about putting the data in the cloud and trusting the third-party vendor to take care of the data. Companies are worried about spending too much money for storage or for license or subscription costs in the cloud. Companies are worried about the learning curve when it comes to manage a cloud infrastructure like Azure AD, right? So while cloud adoption is good, while increased cloud adoption is good, if we are not able to secure the cloud service, it is a threat to the users in your organization. It is a threat to the data in your organization. And it is also a threat to your on-premises infrastructures, because essentially, when you deploy a cloud service alongside an on-premises infrastructure like AD, you are exposing your on-premise infrastructure to certain security risks or security threats as well, right? So if you think about Azure AD from a security perspective, you will notice that Azure is, yes, it's relatively new. much better than Active Directory, but because it's so new, vulnerabilities in Azure are still being discovered. Right? Azure, yes, it does support AD, it does support multiple applications, but that also means Azure has to secure multiple connections. For example, cloud to on-premise, cloud to any other application that Azure supports. How well does Azure secure the connections to these applications that it supports? Right? Azure has a lot of tools and interfaces to manage it, but is a lot of tools and interfaces the answer when it comes to efficient administration or security? Because when we have a lot of tools, when we have a lot of interfaces to manage or to enforce security, it only leads to confusion, right? And Azure, yes, it does offer additional services or additional security, but all of this happens with an additional price. And is this price justified, right? Is this hike in price justified for the features that Azure offers, right? So what are the security risks Microsoft Azure can introduce in your organization, right? Be it an on-premise infrastructure or be it a standalone Azure infrastructure. So what are the risks it can introduce? Before we head into the risks, it's important to understand that this webinar is based on security. It's all about securing your Azure infrastructure. And when we speak about security, the first thing that comes to mind is auditing, right? So auditing is a way to record security changes that are occurring in your infrastructure. These could be security permission changes on a user that were made by another user. These could be changes that were triggered by another process, right? These could be changes that could be an attack attempt or a malicious attempt by an internal employee or an external user. So essentially in organizations, the only way to detect security changes on infrastructures like Azure Active Directory is to record all the changes. That's step number one. Step number two is to collect all the changes. And step number three is to filter the collected changes, decode them, decipher them to truly understand what the security changes are, right? So when we speak about Active Directory, we've got our traditional event viewer, right? And if I open up the event viewer, head into the security tab, you will notice that no matter what the change in Active Directory, it could be a change on your files and folders, it could be a change on any of your Active Directory objects or your OUs, as you see right here. Any change on your Active Directory infrastructure will be pushed to this log, the security log in the event viewer, right? Similarly, when we speak about Azure AD auditing, Azure AD records changes in two locations, right? So let me show you those two locations. So if I minimize the screen, open up my browser, head into my Azure AD portal and head into, here you go, head into audit logs. So any change in your Azure AD, just like Active Directory, are pushed to these audit logs. So a user assigned a permission, user added to a group, user assigned a certain admin role, all such changes are pushed here, and any sign in, sign off, or login, log off activities are recorded in the sign in logs in Azure, right? So these are crucial for you to detect any security changes that are happening on your Azure AD infrastructure, right? So not just here, there is one more location where Azure records the security changes, and that is your unified audit log, right? So unified audit log is something in Office 365 that records your Azure changes along with changes in certain other applications supported by Microsoft as well. And the unified audit log can be accessed from the protection.office.com. And once you head in there, you log in, click on search, click on audit log search, and you can search for certain events that are occurring in Azure. You can view their audited activities, right? So any security change, you will be able to search them using the unified audit log right here. Okay. Now, I do not wish to complicate this further. Just know that Azure records changes in the audit logs inside the Azure portal and the unified audit log in the Office 365 Protection and Compliance Center, right? Two areas where Azure records its changes. Now, let's take a look at these logs and let's see how they lack, how they could put your Azure infrastructure or your on-premises infrastructure that is connected with Azure to a security risk or to a security compromise. So the first problem with these logs is that Azure does not support on-premise logs. That's right. So when you sync up your Active Directory infrastructure with Azure, right? Your users, your groups, etc., will be synced to Azure Active Directory. They will be sent to Azure Active Directory. They will be shared with Azure Active Directory. But when it comes from a security or an auditing perspective, these logs that you see in Active Directory do not record Azure AD based events. So if a user who is synced to Azure has some changes done to him or her in Azure, those changes will not be recorded in native AD. Right? Similarly, when you open up the Azure AD portal, you see the logs right here, the audit logs. Any changes happening to that synced user or synced object from on-premises AD in Azure, any changes that's happening on that object in on-premises, etc., will not be recorded in Azure. Right? So again, although both services are by Microsoft, there is no connection, there is no continuity. So any change happening on the object in on-premise will not be shown in Azure. Any change happening in Azure will not be shown in on-premise AD, right? For example, when you install Active Directory, when you install Azure Active Directory alongside Active Directory, what you typically do is you install Azure AD Connect, right? So Azure AD Connect is a service that is used to sync your on-premise user identities to Azure. And when you install Azure AD Connect, right? What happens is all your users, all your groups, all your resources on premises, they are shared or they are synced with Azure, right? For example, when you sync your users to Azure, you sync their passwords as well, right? So whenever you install Azure in most organizations, whenever you deploy Azure, it is done via an option called Express Settings. Now, Express Settings is a way where you can quickly deploy Azure Active Directory that syncs identities to Azure, that starts initial synchronization, and also configures pass hash synchronization to sync the password hashes of users from on-premise AD to Azure AD, right? This is the first step that happens whenever you deploy Azure in organizations, right? This is the recommended password sync mechanism, because when you sync your users, you are supposed to sync your passwords too, right? So when you send your passwords from on-premise AD to an infrastructure like Azure Active Directory, it is important to realize that there is an account that is created on on-premise AD that is responsible to sync these passwords from on-premise AD to Azure, right? And this account is called the MS All account. Now, what is the MS All account? What does it do? The MS All account, in a nutshell, is configured whenever Azure AD Connect is deployed in organizations. Whenever this is deployed, this account is configured. And this account does the job of syncing passwords from on-premise AD to Azure, right? It is important to note that this account has certain privileges on the domain, and those privileges are replicating directory changes and replicating directory changes all. Now, what are these privileges and what do they mean to you from a security perspective? If I minimize my screen, open up my VM, open up my Active Directory users and computers tool, this is my domain node, right? If I right click on it, if I head into properties, if I open up the security tab, right? And if I scroll down, you will notice that there are permissions that basically say replicating directory changes all, right? Now, what are these permissions? What do they do? These permissions are used in organizations uh, to basically update the domain controllers of the changes. So let's say there's DC1, there's DC2, there's DC3, right? So whenever there's a change occurring in one of the domain controllers, the other domain controllers uses an account with these permissions to query for those changes and update itself of those changes. So if there's a change on DC2, DC1 uses an account with the replicating directory changes permission to ask DC2 about the changes and then update itself, right? So for example, when you change a password for a user account, the replicating directory changes permissions on the domain are used by one domain controller to update the other domain controller of that password change. That's the whole reason. That's the whole functionality of these permissions. And in case of Azure, the permissions are used to sync passwords or to send passwords from an on-premise AD infrastructure to Azure, right? So from a security perspective, most attackers target the Connect account. Why do the attackers target the Connect account? Because once they target the Connect account, Once they target this account and once they are able to extract the password of that account, the attacker will then be able to use that password and the privileges that this account has to basically gain access to other passwords of on-premise users. Right now, let me show you a quick example right here. If I minimize my browser, open up my console, scroll further down, let me show you a quick video right here. Right. So this is an attack that I performed, and I just wanted to show you how it all works. Right. So here's what's going to happen. Once an attacker gains access to the sync account's password, once the attacker is able to decrypt the password, the attacker using the sync account's permissions or privileges can gain access to any password hash of the user on the domain. Here you go. Here you have the password hash of your administrator user. So as you can see, I've entered the domain name, I've entered the username, who happens to be the administrator, and within a few seconds, here I have the plain text password. Right? Pretty straightforward. Using these privileges, an attacker can gain access to any password of any on-premise AD users, right? And like I said, your Azure logs, they do not record any of these attack attempts because technically all of these attacks are happening on your on-premise infrastructure. They're not happening in Azure. So your Azure logs, they do not record these logs that you see right here, these beautiful logs, they do not record any of those changes, right? So how do you detect these changes? How do you detect such attacks that are happening on your network? The only way to detect such attacks happening on your network is to basically monitor your on-premise infrastructure for changes. That is something we can help with. So if I minimize this, open up my browser, head into AD Audit Plus, head into reports, as you can see right here. And if I scroll down, if I click on permission changes right here, do you see this called domain level permission changes? So the next time an account is assigned any permissions on the domain level, right? In this case, the replicating directory changes permission, right? So if an attacker is trying to assign an account these permissions in order to gain access to your Active Directory passwords or the passwords of your AD users, you will immediately be notified because AD Audit Plus also alerts you whenever such changes happen, right? So speaking more from the attacks perspective, if I head into server audit and if I scroll down, do you see this called PowerShell auditing, right? If I open up script block auditing, right? So the next time your users, they execute a script like so, that is used to extract the credentials of the Azure AD Connect user, the MSOL user, you will be able to capture that user, right? Because with the script block logging, you will be able to notice what the scripts are and what the scripts do on your domain, right? You can also audit certain modules on your domain. For example, whenever your users invoke certain commands to detect certain to basically query for certain information or to basically crack the password of the Azure Connect account, you can detect those commands on your domain, right? So I do have a few screenshots here that I took in just yesterday to detect this particular attack, and they look something like this, right? So let me quickly show that to you. Here you go. Here is a script that was essentially used to extract the password of the AD Sync Connect account, right? And here is uh, a PowerShell module that was used to extract the passwords of the AD Sync account. Here you go. Here is the command that was executed by the user to extract the passwords of the MSOL account that is used to sync your users from on-premise AD to Azure. Right? So all of this is possible with PowerShell auditing. Unfortunately, these are script-based attacks, and the only way you can detect them is by monitoring the scripts that your end users are running, and that can be done with PowerShell auditing in AD Audit Plus. Right? This is a component of AD 360. Right? So that's why I say monitoring your on-premise and your Azure events is crucial, and more importantly, connecting these two events and truly understanding what's happening is even more important. Now, let me show you another quick example right here, right? Let me quickly open up my VM, open up my PowerShell session, right? And here's what I'm going to do. I will quickly import a PowerShell module, right? The module's name is MSAll Spray. It's on my screen right now. I'm going to give in MSAll Spray.ps1, right? The module is imported. Let's just give this a few seconds. Okay, looks like there is a command mistake here. Let me quickly do that again. So import module dot slash MSAll spray.ps1, right? So the PowerShell module is imported, and I'm going to run a command called invoke MSAll spray, and I'm going to give in a password. Let's say password at 123, and I'm going to give in a user list. Let's say user list.txt. Right now, as an on-premise user, I have a list of user email addresses right here that I will be using in this attack. And what does the attack do? If I hit enter, you will notice that within a few seconds, I have the Azure user who synced from on-premise AD and the user's password. Right? The password is expired, but then again, I can still log in as that user and reset the password and truly lock out the user from his or her account. Now, how could this attack happen, Han? And how do you detect this attack in on-premises and Azure environments? Right now, before I head into the specifics of the attack, let's discuss how we could get a list of email addresses. Right. So it's pretty easy for an Azure user in an organization to get a list of email addresses because all the user needs to do is just blow up PowerShell, type in connect Azure AD, and hit enter. And once the user does that, the user has to enter his or her credentials. And once the user enters his or her credentials, he or she can query for all Azure emails in the organization. Right? For external attackers who are trying to launch a password attack on an Azure AD infrastructure, there are many ways external attackers can detect email addresses or discover email addresses on an Azure infrastructure. Now, that could happen in many ways. For example, here is a blog that I had written where an external user using many tools can discover email addresses in Azure, and the tool will also tell you if the email address is valid or invalid in Azure as well. Right? So I do not want to complicate the email discovery process further, but just know that discovering email addresses as an internal user is pretty easy. Discovering email addresses as an external user is also pretty easy as well. And once you have a list of email addresses from an on-premises account, you can launch a full-blown attack on an Azure AD infrastructure. And that's why I say, ladies and gentlemen, monitoring AD and monitoring Azure together is the need of the hour because all components are connected. Security must be connected as well, and we can help you do that, right? So if I open up my browser and if I open up AD audit tools, right, all you got to do is head into reports, right? Head into Azure AD right here, and do you see this called logon activity? Or let me quickly show you this console reports Azure AD, and do you see this logon activity? So what logon activity does is it records any password or logon failures in an Azure environment, right? So we have a separate logon failures report that does this particular task as well, right? And what's more, you get to know if the user is an on-premise user because there are on-premises details of that user as well. You get to know what the user's on-premises details are. You get to know what the user's cloud details are, and using the details that pertain to the user's on-premises identity and the cloud's identity, you will be truly able to understand where the attacker is coming from. If the attacker is attacking from an on-premise Active Directory system or from an Azure AD system, right? So what these logs essentially do is they give you information about the on-premise properties and the cloud properties of that user as well. So you will be able to track down and realize from where the attack is happening. And of course, inside server audit tab, we've got the PowerShell auditing. So the next time your users are executing scripts, right, like the MSALT script that we just executed to gain a list of user passwords, whenever your users execute scripts, the script block logging right here will capture the scripts where you can read into the function blocks of the scripts, you can read into the code blocks of the scripts, and not just that, you can also find out specific commands that were invoked by your end users, right? Commands like this, invoke MSALT spray or import module. Whenever your users are importing weird PowerShell modules, whenever your end users are invoking any attacks in your organization, it could be an end user, it could be a compromised end user account. These reports will capture those changes. You can search for these reports. You can find out if a user who's really not supposed to execute scripts is executing scripts on your network. And of course, all of these scripts can be configured into alerts as well, right? For example, let's say there are more than 5 logon failures occurring in Azure in under a minute, right? Your logon failures report that you see right here will capture those changes. And not just that, you can also set up alerts saying, hey, if there are more than 5 logon failures occurring in under a minute, it could be an automated password attack. So throw me an alert, let me know via an email or an SMS that there could be an attack on my organization, right? If your end users, let's say, are executing scripts outside of business hours, and really they have no job executing scripts at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in the morning, you will immediately receive an alert, right? And not just that, you can mitigate certain activities as well. Now, what does this option do? Let's say your user is trying to launch a password attack on your Azure infrastructure from an on-premise system, right? And you've got an alert mechanism in AD Audit Plus that tells you whenever an on-premise user is trying to compromise an Azure AD user or Azure AD bunch of users, right? These alerts will alert you, and the script right here can be used to basically disable the attacker's account or terminate the attacker's account or even shut down the attacker's system. So this script right here will act as a remedial action to the attacks that occur in your Azure environment from your typical on-premise Active Directory environment, right? So again, this attack is just another example of as to why it's important for you to sync up your on-premise identities and your cloud identities, because attacks can happen from an on-premise workstation into the cloud as well, right? Problem 2 with Azure AD auditing is that Azure supports complete compatibility to your legacy applications or your older applications. For example, when we speak about legacy authentication in Azure, we've got applications like your Windows 10 Mail or your Exchange Active Sync or any other app like your Office 360, some of your Office 365 apps that use legacy authentication, right? So this is an older mode of authentication that use IMAP, POP, and any other older authentication protocols. And Azure, in order to support these applications, offers compatibility with legacy authentication. Right? So what is legacy authentication? Why does Azure offer support to it? And why is it risky? The reason Azure offers support to it is because Azure must support your on-premise applications as well. If you can recollect, this was one of our first requirements when we adopt a cloud service. Azure must be able to support your on-premise applications. And that's why Azure supports legacy authentication. But the problem with legacy authentication is that more than 99% of password attacks use legacy authentication protocols. Legacy authentication, it does not support multi-factor authentication. So again, once a password is broken, your users will have access to any account that uses legacy authentication in your organization, right? So in a nutshell, legacy authentication is important because most applications like your Exchange services or your Windows 10 Mail or certain Microsoft services like Office 365, they use legacy authentication protocols. So this cannot be like banned, you cannot cancel, you cannot block legacy authentication in your organization. It's important that we use them, but with legacy authentication comes a few risks, right? So how can Azure circumvent this issue? How can Azure solve this problem? Now, Azure has a way using something called conditional access policies to block the usage of certain clients that use legacy authentication in your organization, right? Let's say some of your users use Windows 10 Mail and you don't want that happening for security purposes. You can use Azure to stop the usage of that mail client that could put your infrastructure or your user passwords at risk, right? So conditional access policies in Azure are extremely useful to basically ban or block certain applications that use legacy authentication in Azure, right? But you need to know that this feature comes in with an extra price. You need a premium P1 or P2 license, and a premium license costs anywhere between $6 to $9 for each user in your Azure tenant, right? There is one more feature in Azure that can help you solve this problem. For example, if I open up my Azure console, head into properties, scroll a little down, you see manage security defaults. When you enable this, Azure automatically recommends certain security defaults on your tenant, right? And when you enable that, any application that uses legacy authentication, any application like your Windows 10 Mail or your Exchange services or your certain Office 365 services, they are all blocked, right? So legacy authentication in general will be blocked in your organization. So what conditional access policies do? Here you go. These are conditional access policies. What they do is that they let you basically choose certain client apps, right? So you can say, hey, block only my Exchange clients, do not block my other clients. So they give you that granular control to block only the applications that you truly do not need, but that happens with an extra cost. If you use the default settings, namely the settings that I just showed you, right? If you use these settings, your default settings, your legacy authentication will be disabled by default for all applications in your organization, right? But what if blocking legacy authentication is not an option in your Azure infrastructure? Let's say you cannot block legacy authentication to any of these applications because your users are heavily dependent on these applications. Then the only way to detect legacy authentication attacks in your organization is by monitoring the logons in your organization, right? And we can help you with that because in AD Audit Plus, a component of AD 360, we've got reports, and you see this logon activity by applications. You can monitor logons by applications in Azure, right? So if you find any application that uses legacy authentication, do take a look at the number of logon successes on that application or the number of logon failures on that application. This will help you determine if that application that is using legacy authentication is being attacked or not, right? So yes, not just Azure or Active Directory based logons. We help you audit logons application wise in an Azure environment, which can come in very handy in case you want to monitor certain applications that use weaker authentication mechanisms. For example, legacy authentication in Azure, right? And if you've deployed conditional access policies in your Azure infrastructure, for example, if I head into reports right here, and let's say you have a premium license, you've deployed conditional access policies. Whenever a logon is failed due to an applied conditional access policy, you get those reports as well. Now, why is this important? Let me show you an example right here. Do you see this option using which you can ban legacy authentication for a certain clients? After you ban legacy authentication, if someone is still trying to use legacy authentication in your network, you should be alerted as a security analyst or an administrator, right? Because this someone may be trying to break into your network by using this weaker authentication protocol. So even when you've deployed conditional access policies, whenever there are failures due to a conditional access policies, you will be able to capture those failures, right? As you can see, access has been blocked due to conditional access policies, and this will help you determine if someone is trying to use an application to log on to your Azure infrastructure, and this application was banned in your organization due to the weak authentication protocols that apply to this application, right? So this is just another example that Azure supports backward compatibility, but it does so with certain risks or with certain security issues, and we can help you detect that with efficient monitoring features in Azure, right? Problem number 3 with Azure infrastructures is that yes, the audit logs that you see right here can detect some of the security changes. For example, these are my Azure audit logs. The native audit logs that you see, yes, they can detect some of the Azure changes, but they are not that great because they come in with their own set of limitations. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me show you a quick example right here. If I open up Azure, right, and if I head into user settings, do you see this option called restrict access to the administration portal? This by default is set to no in Azure, right? What does this do? Just like your Active Directory infrastructures, your users in Azure by default have read permissions on every resource in Azure, right? All your users can simply log on to the portal that you see right here, and they can view everything that's happening in Azure with respect to anything, because users by default, they have read access to all your tenant information in Azure. Now, how is this a security risk? Because all my users can do is they can only read the permissions, right? So giving read permissions to a user is a security risk because users often use these read permissions to query for information, to get target-rich information about your Azure environments before they plan the attacks in your environment, right? An example for this is just your password spray attack that we just performed, right? The email discovery process is essentially a way where users can log on to your Azure infrastructure, get a list of admin email addresses, and subject them to an attack. Similarly, Azure AD infrastructure gives your users liberal read permissions using which your users can query for any information in Azure. For example, users with privileged roles, users who are members of privileged groups, users who have weak passwords, users who are disabled, and target these users in future attacks, right? Or target these users in attacks. So Azure reconnaissance or gathering information about Azure will allow users to plan their next attack steps in a domain, right? So when you set this option to yes, when you say, hey, I don't want my users reading information from my Azure infrastructure, please block access to the portal, only allow authorized users to access the administration portal, not random users or not users who really don't have a need to access the Azure portal, right? You can block that, but then again, your users can still connect to Azure using a PowerShell session, right? Once you type in connect Azure AD, your end users who were blocked access to the Azure portal for security purposes can still log into Azure and gain access to Azure information like email addresses, etc. Right? So even if the access to the portal is disabled, your users can still log on to Azure by typing in this command on your command line shell. Right? So how do you detect these activities? How do you stop this from happening? So when you type in connect Azure AD, a window pops up where a user has to enter valid credentials to log into Azure and to query for information in Azure, right? Essentially, this is a sign-in activity, right? Users can sign in manually from the portal that you see right here, where a user can sign in manually, or users can sign in using a shell as well, like PowerShell in this case, right? So technically, logically speaking, these events must be recorded in the sign-in logs, right? Because the sign-in logs record sign-in activities, whether they are happening via the command line shell or whether they are happening via the Azure portal, right? Now, here's the problem. Your sign-in logs in Azure, they do not record sign-ins that happen from your on-premises AD infrastructure. Now, if a user logs on to his or her workstation, launches PowerShell, types in connect Azure AD and tries to log into Azure and get information from Azure, these activities, they are not recorded in your Azure portal. The sign-in logs, although this is a sign-in activity, is not recorded in Azure. Right? So your sign-in logs, they don't capture logons via command line shells. And there are many open source tools that leverage this flaw that can help you basically recon, perform reconnaissance, and gain access to Azure information. And Azure logs, they cannot read the execution of these open source tools in your environment because technically they are happening on on-premise AD, and Azure logs, they do not support your on-premise AD infrastructure, right? So I do not wish to complicate this further. Just know that your users, even when banned access to the Azure portal, can log in via the command line shell, query for information, and Azure does not audit these activities, right? But we can help you do that. So the next time your users are logging on to Azure Active Directory, we can help you detect those changes, because if I open up my browser, head into AD Audit Plus, do you see PowerShell auditing again? Unfortunately, most of these are script-based attacks. The only way we can detect these attacks is with PowerShell auditing, right? So whenever your users are running commands like connect Azure AD, module logging will capture those commands, right? So here's my user Harry, and Harry has run certain commands on the domain. And if any of these commands happen to be, there you go. If you type in connect Azure AD, if you find any of your users trying to connect to Azure AD in your environment, it could be a reconnaissance or an enumeration attempt in your Azure environment, and it is a security risk. And we can help you detect those changes. We can help you set up alerts for those as well, right? You see this probable enumeration. So the next time your users, they are trying to query for information from Azure or from Active Directory, you can detect those changes, you can detect those information gathering attempts, and you can set up alerts, because these could be probable enumeration alerts on your domain. And enumeration or information gathering is the first step before performing an attack in any environment, be it AD, be it Azure, and we can help you detect both those activities because we audit PowerShell thoroughly, right? So if your users are trying to log on to Azure via PowerShell, if your users are trying to query for AD information via PowerShell, we detect those activities. You can set up alerts that signify enumeration or information gathering attempts. Problem number 4 is that Azure only stores logs for a limited time. Now, all the logs that you see right here, they are, I'm so sorry, all the logs that you see right here, they are stored in Azure only for a limited amount of time, right? And what are the time problems that come in with Azure? With the Azure free license, the audit logs and the sign-in logs, they're only stored for 30 days. With a premium license, sorry, with the free license, they're only stored for 7 days. With the premium license, they're only stored for 30 days, right? So after 30 days, if you want to look into these logs, and if you want to notice any activity that's happened, any group membership change, any user, any permission that is assigned to a user, any admin role assigned to a user, any login activity or logon failure activity, you cannot do so because these logs, they're only stored on a monthly basis. So after 30 days, you will lose all your logs, right? Now, what if you need to find out changes for security purposes, or for even for the time when your compliance officers, they come knocking, right? There is one more way in Azure using which you can send the logs that are audited only for a limited time and store them in a storage account in Azure. So yes, these are the logs. You can export the logs and store them in an Azure storage account, right? So you can, again, view these logs later on if you need to for security purposes or for compliance purposes. But the problem with this is that the storage accounts in Azure, in order to transfer logs to the storage account, you will again need a premium license, as you can see right here. So without a premium license, you cannot save the logs that are recorded in Azure, right? And the more space your logs consume, the more money you have to pay, because Azure is based on a pay-as-you-go license. So the more space your logs occupy in the storage accounts in Azure, the more money you have to pay in order to store those logs. So if you decide to store logs for a long, long time, let's say for 6 months or 7 months, the more space they occupy, the more money you have to pay based on your Azure license, right? So Azure, again, has its own limitations when it comes to security and when it comes to charging money even. Logs aren't stored for a long time, so we let you transfer the logs to the storage account. But then again, to use the storage account, pay more money, right? To save the logs for a longer time, pay more money. And this is not a good scenario when it comes to organizations, because we cannot keep buying licenses. We cannot keep shedding out money or burning a hole in our pocket just for Azure Active Directory, right? So we can help you solve those issues, because in AD Audit Plus, a component of Log 360, you can head into the configuration tab, I'm sorry, the admin tab, and do you see this called archive events? This will help you archive all the events that you see right here in your Azure AD infrastructure, right? So all your audit logs, all your sign logs, they can be saved in the archive events option that you see right here. You can restore the archive events, you can search through the archive events, and what's more, you needn't pay extra. So to archive events, we don't charge you money because we let you archive events on your local server, right? So you needn't use a storage account in Azure to save your archived events, but we let you store the archived events on your local server. So whenever you need them, just import them back into your AD Audit Plus console and view them from the report section that you see right here. Right? So that's how we can help. We don't charge extra money. We let you store the logs on a local server. We let you import the logs whenever you want to. And once you've imported the logs, you can view them in the console that already has reports that are easy to read, that are categorized automatically for your comfort and for your convenience. Right? The fifth problem with Azure is that there are limited and options to sort or filter Azure logs. This is the last problem we will look into today, wherein it is difficult for you to filter certain logs in Azure. For example, when it comes to Azure groups, right? Now you use groups for everything in Azure, right? To give access to Azure resources, to give access to Azure data or SharePoint sites, etc. And here's the problem. If I open up my browser, head into my Azure console, head into audit logs, right? And I'm going to filter this log based on core directory. I'm going to say apply and category. Let's just say group management, right? So I want to see which members are added to a certain group or are removed from a certain group in Azure, right? So I know that this was a group membership addition, not a removal. I know which user was added to the group. I know which user performed the group membership change. All of that is good, but a critical piece of information is missing from these logs, and that is what is the name of the group, right? Now, I know that the group membership has been changed. I know who has been added to the group. I know which user made that membership change or which user performed the group membership change. But what is the name of the group? How would I get information like this? The only way to get that information is to click and look through the advanced properties. So if you check here, you won't find it. Look through the targets. This was the target that was added to the group, which is good. If I head into modified properties, here is the name of the group. The group display name is the all users group, right? That's the problem with Azure logs. Although they give you better filtering, better control when compared to your on-premises Active Directory logs, right? These cannot be filtered that much. Azure logs try to solve that problem by giving you more control over filtering. It's still not easy for you to determine, to see things from a bird's eye view, right? Now, let's say I want to find out a certain group. I want to see if my admin group has been modified in Azure. Which is the easiest way I can do that using these logs? I have to click, 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 and check what the name of the group is. I have to check another log. I have to click and check what the name of the group is. I have to go back in time. I have to click and check what the name of the group is. And if I have to see any group membership change that have occurred 2 months ago, I cannot do so because these logs are only stored for 30 days, right? So the manual effort that must be put in to click, and view, and to view logs that have occurred, to view events that have occurred a long time ago is very difficult using the native audit logs. And the same problem applies to your role management as well, right? So if a user is added to a role in Azure, you know that it's a role membership addition. You know which user was added to the role. You know the actor, the user who performed the role addition or the role change. But in order to get the name of the role, I have to click modify properties, check the name of the role. If I want to see which of my users are privileged authentication administrators in Azure, there is no easy way to do it. I can't search for any users with this role. I can't say copy. I can't paste it anywhere here and search through all these logs. I have to still click and see what the log changes and what the role that was assigned to my user. But we help you sort those issues because if I head into, let's say, role management, right? And let's say recently added member to role. These are all the role membership changes. I can simply hit search right here, and I can search for a role name. Here you go. If I type in security administrators, every user who's been added to the security administrator role will be right here. Here you go. All of these are users with security administrator or security leaders role. So this kind of filtering, this kind of bird's eye view is missing in the native logs, and we help you do that. Right? We help you go back in time. So let's say you want to find role changes or group membership changes that occurred 2 or 3 months ago, we let you do that. If you have multiple Azure domains or tenants, we let you look through those role changes as well. The same logic applies to your groups. So I can search for specific groups and find out their membership changes. Right? So again, the native logs, they have a few issues. They cannot filter them properly. There is no bird's eye view of all group memberships modified. You'll have to check, click, 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 and check, and we let you defeat those minor difficulties as well. Right? Last but not the least, there are certain default settings in Azure that are really not that secure. Here's an example of that. Right? By default, all your users in Azure can register applications in Azure. Right? So users, they can grant consent to applications in Azure. This is a default setting in Azure that can put your environment at risk. Now, why do I say that? So what happens is when this particular setting, users can consent apps to in Azure is enabled, users can be tricked by attackers to providing consent to an application, right? Now, in simple terms, when users consent to an application, the application will be able to access user data on their behalf, right? Once an attacker tricks a user to install a malicious application, and once the user gives permissions to that malicious application, the application will be able to access the data on behalf of the user, and an attacker can view all of this data. Right? This is essentially an attack in Azure without compromising a password or without compromising a user account, because now attackers, they can create a backdoor application and trick users into providing consent to this backdoor application, right? And we let you monitor such changes as well. If I open up AD Audit Plus Azure AD, do you see this application management? Whenever consent is granted to an application, you get to see which user granted consent, you get to see what the name of the application is, you can set up alerts as well. So the next time consent is granted to an application, you will immediately receive an alert. So you can review the application and you can ensure that it is indeed legitimate and secure. Right? So we let you know what the application name is, etc. And we let you know what the consent, what permissions the application consent has granted to that application. So illicit app consents is just another default setting in Azure that can put your organization at risk, and we help you audit such default Azure settings as well. Right? So in a nutshell, limitations of Azure auditing are all the events, they are dumped into a single location. You cannot filter through those events. Events are not retained for more than 30 days. So if you want to view older events, you cannot do so. Azure AD does not support on-premise AD. On-premise AD does not support Azure. So all in all, in an Azure and an AD infrastructure, there should be a connection. There should be synchronization, and Azure does not let you audit events in on-premise and in Azure together, correlate them, and view them for security changes. Right? 8360 can help you with that. 8360 can help you gain insights on all your Azure resources from an IAM perspective. Your user changes, your role changes, your licenses assigned to users, and a lot more. 8360 can also help you gain insight on your Azure permissions, right? So let's say you want to find out which of your users have licenses and what the licenses are. Let's say you want to find out which of your users are administrators in Exchange or administrators in Azure Activity. Let's say you want to monitor your admin activity. Let's say you want to find out what the group memberships are in Azure. Let's say you want to find out security groups and their memberships in Azure. Let's say you want to find out any other information with respect to Azure or the connected applications in Azure. We give you reports that can help you do just that. So these reports will help you decipher your Azure infrastructure and truly understand which user has what permissions in Azure, right? And these reports that you see right here will help you monitor your Azure infrastructure in real time for security changes. So the difference between these reports and these reports is that these reports can be used as a starting off point for you to truly understand which user has what permission and understand the state of your Azure infrastructure. And these reports will help you monitor your Azure infrastructure for changes in real time. So next time there's a security change, these reports will capture that and you will immediately receive an alert, right? Not just Azure, you can monitor your Active Directory infrastructure in real time as well, right? And if you want to more get information on your AD infrastructure. This is also a need because sometimes you sync your AD users to Azure. It's important for you to realize the permissions that your users have on an AD infrastructure. You can do that with this solution, which is also a component of AD 360, right? So just one more second, just give this a few seconds to load. Here you go, reports. This will help you gain information on your Active Directory or your AD infrastructure, right? So all the modules that you see, AD Audit Plus, AD Manager Plus, or Office 365 or Microsoft 365 Manager Plus are all components of a single console called Manage Engine AD 360, right? So AD 360 is the parent solution that hosts all of these sub-modules. So you can choose the modules that you need, and you can access all of them from this single console. So AD Manager Plus, AD Audit Plus, Office 365 Manager Plus, all those consoles can be accessed from this one parent solution, right? So if you want to gain information about the state of your Azure infrastructure, AD 360 can help. If you want to monitor your Azure infrastructure for changes, AD 360 can help as well. And that is about it for today. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for your time. And before I close up on today's webinar, you will find a question that you will see flashing across your screen. If you can help me out with the answers to the question, that would be really, really helpful. This is just for our internal team. So just a few seconds, a minute, and then I promise I will be out of your hair. Thank you for your responses. Much appreciated. Just a few seconds of your time, and I promise I will be out of your hair. Thank you for your responses, guys. Thank you so much. I would love to hear what you thought. If there's any way you think I can improve my sessions, if you want me to cover any other topic, please do let me know. And I will implement that in my upcoming sessions. I would love to hear your thoughts, guys. You should find a question flash across your screen. If you can let me know your thoughts, I would love to hear your feedback so I can improve my future sessions. Just a few seconds of your time. I promise I will be out of your hair. Brilliant. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. I hope you found this session informative. If there is any question on your mind or if there's anything you'd like to ask me, just shoot me an email at rb@manageengine.com and I'd be more than happy to help you out any way I can. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And I hope to see you in the upcoming sessions. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.